All right, so in the first part of the lesson, we started out by examining how Christianity is more than just religion. If it's only a faith-based system, and that's all there is to it, then it's on the exact same level playing field as every other religion out there, even arguably dating back to, say, the Greek or the Roman gods. It's absolutely no different than any other religion. But if you view Christianity as a history, a set of historical events that actually took place, then it has to be true. If there is historical legitimacy in it, then it's all true, and you have to believe it. I mean, it is a fact that has dealings with your eternal salvation. So if we can examine the evidences and look at it from a historical standpoint and prove that it really is all true, then there's no reason to not believe it. And then we looked at a couple evidences for the existence of God in general, and now we're currently going through and looking at basically the case for Christ. This is all coming. This is a summary of the book Cold Case Christianity. So just a brief summary of everything that's in this book. It's certainly not exhaustive. There's plenty more in here that I did not include, so I do encourage reading that if these topics so interest you. So currently we're looking at the death of Christ. So to go back, the death scene of Christ, there's 4 facts that are accepted both by Christians, historians, and even critics of the faith. And that is, Jesus died on the cross and he was buried. The tomb was empty, but no body was ever found. Disciples believed they saw Jesus, and after believing they saw Jesus, the disciples had a transformation of character, the type that would turn this poor fisherman into one of the world's most powerful speakers, who would then travel across the Roman Empire despite persecutions and ultimately being executed. So he took a fisherman up to one of the greatest teachers of all time. That's the type of transformation that we see in the apostles. And there's 7 explanations for those 4 facts, and we're currently going through those. And I believe the last one we talked about was the disciples were delusional. So that brings us up to the disciples were fooled by an impostor. No, we talked about that one. So the next one is 1 or 2 disciples had a vision and then convinced the other disciples that their vision was true. This can account for the death of Christ, but it only partially accounts for having believed to have seen Jesus, and only partially accounts for their transformation of character. Here's some problems with this belief. First, a persuasive witness can never convince everyone of a story. You go to any type of criminal trial in court, and you realize that just one witness, no matter how convincing their story, will never be able to convince everyone that the person on trial should be guilty. Second, this does not account for the empty tomb or the missing body. So it can't explain the fact that we know, historically speaking, Jesus was put in the tomb and then all of a sudden his body vanished. It doesn't account for that. Third, it doesn't take into consideration that Jesus was cited on numerous separate occasions and in group interactions. So this was more than just a vision. This wasn't just look, there's a cloud that looks kind of like Jesus in the sky, which I see on Facebook all the time. We're not talking about that. We're talking there was a physical person that had interactions with other people. This is something that requires stimulation of all your physical senses here. This isn't just some imaginary picture in the sky. This is real life physical interactions. And so we see as you go through the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, 1 Corinthians, all of them contain verses showing different instances where after Jesus was resurrected, he interacted with different groups of people. So it wasn't just 1 or 2 individuals that was able to convince everyone. This is Jesus appearing to a whole lot of people who just happen to see the exact same Jesus and interact with him in the same way. And that's something that this explanation of only 1 or 2 disciples, it can't account for that. I'm going to be going kind of fast. I can email anybody a copy of this if you want. I'm going to try to fly through this. Disciples' accounts were distorted over time, meaning that, the disciples' original writings, which we don't have, they were much milder and tamer than what we currently have, which has been grossly exaggerated and included things like miracles. Okay, but that doesn't account for anything, really. I mean, arguably, maybe Jesus died. Okay, it could account for that depending on how much you say their accounts were distorted, but it doesn't really address the fact that, historically speaking, we know that he died, we know that he was in the tomb and there's a missing body. It doesn't account for the fact that they believed to see Jesus. It doesn't account for the fact that they had transformation of character, because all of these things have been proven in a secular history. And also, the earliest Christian writings, non-biblical Christian writings, just people like you and me who were going to the church of the first century, they were writing back and forth too. And in their writings, they detailed all of these other things as well. And so this thing of being distorted over time, it doesn't really hold any water. Lastly, the disciples were truthful and accurate. Well, okay, so that accounts for everything. That explanation that the disciples were telling the truth, that is a reasonable explanation for all of the historical evidence that we have. The problem with this, though, is it would require you to believe in supernatural events, which is something that a lot of people aren't okay with. But none of this matters if it's all false. If their writings were false, it doesn't matter. C.S. Lewis wrote, "Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance, and if true, is of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important." So if it's true, then you have to live by it if you want to go to heaven. If it's not true, then it doesn't matter what you do. You don't get to pick and choose. It's either way. It's nice to think, well, there's a middle ground. No, not really. It either matters or it doesn't matter. To be viewed as a historical fact, we have to examine the reliability of the witnesses we have. So let's look at some principles of testing your witness according to a homicide detective. Reliability, based on was the witness there? Well, okay, to be a good witness, you have to be there. 2, have they been honest and accurate? 3, can they be verified? Are there other sources that could indicate they're being truthful? 4, do they have any ulterior motive, any type of bias that would motivate them to lie or to exaggerate or distort or anything like that? Okay, some expectations that you would have for witnesses. Well, maybe not you and I, because we're not as studied in this, but as a police officer who is trying to solve a murder, some expectations he naturally has when he's talking to witnesses, first is that each witness will have a unique perspective, because not everyone's sitting in the exact same place. They're going to see things from different angles. Everyone's going to have a different personal focus. We all come from different backgrounds in our lives. So if we talk sports, I know John's going to be interested. If we talk business, Harry's going to be very interested. So we all have these different interests, and as such, if we were to write a life story about ourselves, we're probably going to focus on different things. 3, they will contain areas of total agreement. There are going to be certain things that they absolutely agree on, but then there might be some areas of a little bit of disagreement. And then later statements fill in gaps. That's just saying that witnesses that come later usually are able to fill in those details that the first witnesses to come forward didn't provide. That's just the way witnesses work. I know that sounds kind of weird, but from somebody who deals with witnesses all the time, that's just the way it works. Okay, so about that disagreement thing. So disagreements are not disqualifiers. I hope you guys can read that. But this is an actual case that he worked on, describing a robbery of a convenience store. So we had 2 different witnesses to this. We had a female named Sylvia Ramos. The names were changed. These are not the actual names. And then the second witness is Paul Mayer. And so this is how they describe the robbery. Now, they're both witnesses to the same robbery. So Sylvia says the culprit here, the robber, he was a young boy in his teens. He was very polite and had a sweet voice. He did not have a gun. He bought something at the store. He was wearing an Izod polo shirt, and he had no vehicle. Okay, second witness, same crime. Mr. Paul here, he says it was a man in his mid-20s. He had a threatening scowl. He also had a Ruger P95 9mm handgun. He bought nothing at the store. He might have worn a T-shirt, and he ran to a 90s tan Nissan. Same crime, 2 different witnesses. Both witnesses are in the store. Now, you and I looking at this is like, can't believe either one of them. That's crazy, right? Okay, well, Sylvia was standing behind the robber, and Paul was standing in front of the robber behind the counter. He was a friend of the person working the cash register. Sylvia could only see his back and hear his voice. She didn't see his face. She couldn't see the gun. She thought she heard what was being a purchase being transacted because she saw an exchange of money. But then Paul, from the other side, he could hear the voice, but he saw the scowl. He could actually see the gun that was in front of him. And from the angles, after the robber left from where Sylvia was standing, she couldn't see that when the robber rounded the corner, he went to a vehicle, something that only Paul could see from where he was standing. All the details are accurate from their perspective. And only by taking into account all the details from both their perspectives could he have solved this crime. Just because there's a disagreement doesn't mean it's a contradiction. Something else to consider when we're talking about witnesses and evidence. There's a difference between an artifact and an evidence. At a crime scene, if you have a cigarette butt, at a crime scene. This was another case that he worked on where a cigarette butt almost cost him the conviction of a convicted serial killer because there was a cigarette butt located something like 30 feet away from this dead body. And the defense attorney was saying the DNA on that cigarette butt does not match the suspect that is on trial here. And so the detective said, well, that's because it didn't belong to him. The cigarette butt belonged to the neighbor who had nothing to do with this murder. But he had to actually show how the cigarette butt didn't fall in place. So this is one of those things where there are actually a couple of verses that are in the Bible that we have that really all the evidence says they probably shouldn't be there. There's only a couple, like maybe 5 or 6, but none of them change the meaning of the verses. And more importantly, how do we know they're not supposed to be there unless we have an accurate record of what is supposed to be there? So these couple Bible verses, people will say, oh, well, I can't remember the exact passage. I think it's John chapter 8. Well, these verses in John chapter 8, they're not supposed to be there. So you just can't believe anything the Bible says. How do you know they're not supposed to be there? Unless you know what is supposed to be there. There's a difference between an artifact and an evidence. It's like if you open up like a kitchen drawer or something and you pull out a puzzle and you solve the puzzle and the puzzle's complete, but there's an extra puzzle piece there. Oh, that whole puzzle is garbage. This piece doesn't fit. No, you don't throw away the whole puzzle. You realize, oh, this piece isn't supposed to be here because you have an accurate picture. It's the exact same principle. All right. We'll talk about conspiracy theories really quick, and then we'll get into examining the witnesses. All right. Rules for a successful conspiracy. Small number of conspirators. The perfect conspiracy is described as 2 people and the first kills the second after they commit the crime. That way, nobody can snitch on anybody else. All right. The former state police officer in the room agrees. All right. Thorough and immediate communication. So there has to be planning involved ahead of time. It has to be thorough. It has to be immediate. They have to make exact plans so that they tell the same story. The conspiracy has to occur over a short period of time because it's going to be very hard for them to maintain the exact same story over a long period of time. Okay? They have to have a significant personal connection. I'm not going to enter a conspiracy with some stranger I meet on the street to go rob a bank because when he gets picked up and he's being threatened with a life sentence or something drastic like that, he's probably going to be like, oh, I wasn't the only one, he did it too. But yet, if I'm doing it with Chase, maybe he might cover for me. He probably wouldn't, but he might. It increases the likelihood if they have a significant personal connection. But lastly, little or no pressure to the story. There's no one challenging the conspiracy. So there's no one to call you out on it and to test your lies. Because that's what you're going to be telling, it's lies. And the more lies you tell, well, the more detailed your lies have to become, and the more detailed they become, the easier the lies are to prove as being false. So if they're not ever challenged, it's easier to get away with it. Okay, well, let's look at the Christian conspiracy. Okay, so the most significant New Testament claim is the resurrection of Christ. The most common argument is that it was a conspiracy. That's of the 7 principles we looked at earlier for critics of Christianity. The most common one is that it was all a lie. It was a conspiracy. Okay, well, let's look at this. So there was a large number of conspirators. On a small scale, there was at least the 11 disciples. On a large scale, we know that Jesus appeared to over 500 different witnesses. So, depending on how you want to look at this, anywhere from 11 to 500 people would have to be involved in this conspiracy and telling the exact same story. Without quick communication with one another, they didn't have cell phones 2,000 years ago. Okay, they had to walk places. If they were rich enough to afford a donkey, maybe they rode a donkey or a camel to places. Okay, but there was no instant communication to make sure people were telling the same story. And it was scattered across the Roman Empire. This isn't next-door neighbors here. We're talking up to hundreds of miles away. Okay, they retold their story countless times across decades. This isn't one isolated event that they hope nobody discovers. They're retelling the story countless times over decades. It's going to be hard to maintain a lie that long. That little personal connection. Peter and Andrew were brothers. James and John were brothers. But the rest of the apostles didn't really know each other. Not really. I mean, I guess because they were all in the same general region, it's possible they could have known each other, but they don't really have any strong connections aside from the brothers here. Immeasurable pressure. They had lifelong persecution for their actions. And all the apostles except for John were executed for this. You want to talk about pressure, I'd say getting crucified upside down, like Peter was, that'd be some pretty heavy pressure there in order to die for a lie, something you know is a lie. There's not a single record of any disciple recanting their faith, something that very likely would have been widely publicized across Jewish and Roman culture, which openly persecuted Christians and wanted to prove it wrong. If there was any record of a disciple recanting their faith, it probably would have went viral in the first century since. It is either the greatest conspiracy of all time, or it's true. All right, let's talk about martyrs for just a quick second. Not all martyrs are the same, but martyrs die every day. Just look at 9/11. The Muslims, they were martyrs there. Okay, there's a difference between dying for what you believe is true versus dying for what you know by first-hand witness account is either a lie or it is truth, which goes back to that persecution thing. If it was a conspiracy, the disciples were the ones who invented it, and they would know it was a lie. Would all of them be able to withstand the pressure of lifelong persecution for a lie? All right, let's get down to actually examining the witnesses. So the first question, were they actually present? Because if the accounts of the disciples, if they lived, say, 200 years after Christ, then there's no way they could have actually been there. So let's look at just a couple things. The first 2 points here have to deal with historical fact, and that is the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD, and previous to the destruction of the temple, the 3-year siege of Jerusalem from 67 to 70 AD. These were huge, monumental events in Jewish history. Remember, the disciples were Jewish. It would be kind of a big deal. Most of them stuck around the Jerusalem area for this time being, probably fled right before this because Christ prophesied about it. And if Christ prophesied about it, and then it came true, as a follower of Jesus, I would want to write about it to prove that his prophecy was true, as an added fact. But it's not in there. Why is it not in there? Well, one possible explanation is because it happened after the gospel accounts were written. Luke doesn't describe the deaths of Paul, Peter, or James, the brother of Jesus. Pretty big people when you're talking about Christianity. These are some significant players. That would be like LeBron James declaring his retirement and then nobody says anything about it. It'd be a pretty big deal, okay? But yet Luke, when he's writing Acts, and he details the deaths of a couple other disciples, he doesn't mention the deaths of them. Well, one possible explanation is because they died after Luke wrote the book of Acts. Luke's gospel predates Acts. We know this just because if you read them side by side, the way they're written, it's written as like a 2-part thing. And Luke's part 1 and Acts is part 2. Luke comes before Acts. Paul quotes Luke when he writes to Timothy and to the church at Corinth. So if you have Paul, who's writing to Corinth in 50 AD, who is quoting Scripture from the book of Luke, and is expecting the church at Corinth to know that it's coming from Luke, then logically, the Corinthians already had the Gospel of Luke by 50 AD. Paul's description of Jesus in all of his letters, ranging from around 48 to the mid-60s AD, are in harmony with the description of Jesus in the Gospels, which means Paul, he wasn't with Jesus. He wasn't walking with him like the other apostles were. So when he's describing Jesus, he had to base that description off of something. So it's logical to assess that maybe he's basing it off of the fact that the writings of the gospel writings were in existence before 48 AD. Now, Paul told the Galatians in 53 AD that he met Peter and James 14 years previously. So let's back up 53 AD, approximately when he wrote Galatians. Let's back that up 14 years. Now we're down to 39 AD when he met Peter and James. So now we're talking just a few years after Christ's death on the cross. So now we're talking just a couple years. It's very likely that they were alive and were actually there now. Luke quotes Matthew and Mark. So if we know that Luke was in existence way before 50 AD, and he's quoting Matthew and Mark, then Matthew and Mark had to have come before Luke. Now, Mark's tone has a sense of urgency. This is really important because at the time, a lot of the Christians who were close to Jesus, when he said that the judgment was coming soon, they thought they meant like tomorrow. So they were like in a hurry to get this message out. And that's why Mark, who is arguably between Matthew and Mark, we don't know the exact dates, being the first gospel written, might have had a sense of urgency in the way that he used words. Mark also appears to protect the identity of individuals. He doesn't name a lot of people. One reason for that could be that he's protecting the identity of people who were speaking out against the Jews. And the reason to protect their identity would be if they're still alive, he wouldn't want the Jews to capture them. And then separately, non-biblical writings confirm names, places, and events. something we'll talk about a little bit more. So to recap this, based on internal observations and external historical evidences, it's reason to believe the disciples were present during the first century. So they were there. But were they corroborated, though? Is there anything else that can back this up? So there's two types of corroboration. There's internal and external. Internal corroboration is looking at the Scriptures, and there's unintentional support amongst the writers. See, not one Gospel contains all the details, but if you examine all the Gospels, it can help answer questions brought up by other accounts. Google search internal evidences of the Bible, and you'll find a whole long list of these. This is one example. Feeding of the 5,000. Mark chapter 6 tells us there's a crowd, but it doesn't tell us where the crowd came from. Just boom, there's 5,000 people. How did that happen? John chapter 6 tells us, well, they followed Jesus after hearing of his miracles, and they were traveling for the Passover. Passover was a pretty big deal to the Jews. That's why there was such a large crowd. Okay, but wait a minute. But John chapter 6 specifically names Philip and Andrew, which is kind of weird because they're not named very often. And it's even more strange to kind of name them in this situation when Jesus specifically turns to Philip and says, Philip, where do we get food? Well, that's kind of odd. Why would he do that? Well, Luke tells us that they were in Bethsaida when this happened, and John chapter 1 tells us that Philip and Andrew were from Bethsaida. Internal proofs, unintentional support. There's a bunch of these. This is just my favorite example because you can see how each gospel builds on the other one. All right, now let's look at some external evidence. First is names. So I'm not going to read from that. Just a recap. There was a study done on names used in the past, specifically in the Middle East region from 330 BC to 200 AD. And interestingly enough, this study found that the usage of names matches perfectly with the New Testament usage of names, meaning that if secular history says 12% of people were named John, if you look at the Bible, approximately 12% of people in the New Testament were named John. I don't remember the exact numbers. I made up that 12%, but that's the type of study that came out. So, therefore, the writers had to have been very familiar with naming conventions of people in the first century in order for that to happen. If you look at the same study, which covered Egypt as well, Egypt had a different set of names. So these weren't people in Egypt who were writing and were guessing what names. These had to be people that were actually there for them to get the names right. All right, let's look at another one. People and places. Okay, there's, again, a whole bunch of these. There's been a lot of archaeological studies and discoveries that have confirmed the locations, peoples, and events that are specifically named in the New Testament. Again, there's a whole long list of these. I picked out these because these were some of the ones that, previous to their archaeological discoveries, critics said they don't exist. Because they don't exist, the Bible has to be false. Well, joke's on you because archaeologists found them. So there's Quirinius' census, mentioned in Luke 2. Don't have the date for when that was discovered, but it happened. Previously didn't think it happened. Same with Lysanias. He was a ruler in Abilene. There was previously no record of a Lysanias in Abilene until archaeology said, oh, here's a record of it. Guess the Bible's right. And then here's three places, Araxes, Iconium, and the pool of Bethesda. Okay, these places, you can see the dates when these places were discovered. But previous to their discovery, these were places that critics would say, there's no Araxes, Bible's false, can't believe it. Nope, you can believe it because it's there. Thanks, archaeologists. We can thank Harrison Ford for that one, maybe even. Indiana Jones reference. All right, let's look at a couple more external ones. So this is probably the most fascinating to me, is if you look at anti-Christian historians, these are people who are not Christians. They have no reason to support Christianity. They're just simply historians who are writing down what happened. Josephus, probably the most famous one. You can see these are the dates of when they lived. He was a Roman and Jewish historian. Okay, you have Thallus, he was a Samaritan historian. We have a Roman historian, a Syrian historian. We have Phlegon, have no idea what he was, other than he wrote frequently against Christianity. And then we have the Jewish Talmud, which is a collection of rabbinical writings. So it's just like Jewish discussions. Think of it as like a Jewish blog post. This is just a bunch of Jewish leaders who are coming together and writing their thoughts on things as they're happening. But what did these people say about Jesus? Well, here's a lot of things they said. They said Jesus lived in Judea. He was a virtuous man. He had magical powers. He could predict the future. He taught his disciples. He attracted both Jews and Gentiles alike to his teachings. He was called the Christ. He was believed to be the Savior. He became known as the wise king of the Jews. his disciples were called Christians. He was accused by Jewish leaders. He was crucified by Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. At the time of his death, there was a 3-hour-long total eclipse of the sun accompanied by an earthquake. Imagine that, exactly like the Bible records, and history says the same thing. And claims of his resurrection quickly spread across the Roman Empire. This isn't from the Bible. This is from people who do not want the Bible to be true. But yet, here we have this description of Jesus by them, which is exactly what the Bible says. So, we know that it's very logical to believe that the disciples were there in the first century, and it's very logical to believe that the information they presented was both truthful and accurate. But what about bias, though? Oh, they were just Christians who just wanted to support their cause. You can't believe them. They were too biased. What would they gain from it? So Mr. James Warner Wallace here breaks it down. He says there's 3 types of motivation that people have. There's the financial material, there's sexual relational, and then there's power. Okay, so first, the material. Would they benefit financially or materially from their writings and their teachings? Sorry, the text is kind of small, but I wanted it to all fit on one slide. Christ and his disciples' teachings were consistently against money and materialism. So first, they would be hypocrites if that was the case. The disciples also lived an impoverished life, both by their own accounts in the New Testament, but also historical accounts as well, which detailed how they did live a poor, destitute life and were openly persecuted. Third, non-biblical writings confirm their lives. Okay, I already talked about that. And so if hypocrites, their audience would know. So if Paul was like rolling around in a Mercedes, people would kind of call him out on that when he's teaching how you should be giving all to the poor. Okay? So that he would get called out on it. All right, 2, sexual relational. Would they benefit socially by their actions? Well, their teachings were consistently against lust and pride. So once again, they would be hypocrites. 2, the biblical writings show that many of the disciples had wives, and non-biblical writings also detail that their wives would often travel with them to help spread the gospel. And then 3, constant persecution isn't exactly popular or very attractive. I was what you think about that. Who would you rather be with? The person who's just constantly getting beaten and thrown in prison, or the guy who looks like he's pretty successful and is running the local market down the street? All right, I probably wouldn't be casting your luck with the guy who's in prison. All right, 3, power. Would they gain any power from this? Well, if they did, they sure didn't use it, because they didn't have any power to protect themselves against being persecuted and condemned to death. Christian teachers were even at a higher risk of being persecuted, so the fact that they were the ones who were traveling around and openly teaching it put them at a higher risk of being persecuted than everyone else. And once again, they openly taught against having power, and they focused their teachings, just as Christ did, on servitude, on being a servant to other people, and not about being powerful. And again, bias of religion. They wanted others to follow their religion. Well, they were Jews. They were wanting an earthly king to rain down military might and establish the nation of Israel as the world dominant power until Christ proved them wrong. Until they witnessed Christ's miracles and they heard his teachings and they realized that he truly was the Savior that was prophesied about. They did not have a religious bias. Their religious bias would be that earthly king. The only reason they would have changed their mind is if Christ was true. And he really is who he says he is. Talk about that. All right, so recap. It's logical to believe that the disciples were present during the first century. It's logical to believe that the information presented is truthful and accurate. And it's logical to believe that the disciples had no ulterior motive other than just telling the truth. But were they records kept accurately? Okay, so maybe the apostles got it right in their initial writings. But then once again, over time has distorted their writings, and we can't know the actual truth of what really happened. So, we have to examine to use the criminal justice terminology, the chain of evidence there. We have to examine how their evidence was preserved in order to maintain its usefulness and its accuracy. So to do this, we have to start with, well, the crucifix in approximately 33 AD. And we're going to end it with two places here, actually. The oldest complete manuscript of the New Testament was written in about 350 AD. So this has all the books of the New Testament in it, 350 AD. And then the Council of Laodicea, which was a meeting of church leaders, got together in 363 AD and then confirmed the canon of the Scriptures. A lot of people say that they created the canon, saying that, well, the church created the Bible. No, they only acknowledged what already existed. And so we have to establish what happened in the blue area here. So between the crucifix and about 350 AD, could their initial writings have been tainted between that time? There's a lot of information. I'm going to be very brief on this because this is a very long chapter in the book, because each of the individuals that are named in this list have about a full half a page dedicated to their importance in the chain of custody here, in the chain of evidence. And this is looking at the disciple students. So just on the left-hand side, left, we have John, and the numbers there, that's, again, the dates that they lived. Okay, so we have John's disciples, goes all the way down, and historical records can track his disciples down through 236 AD. So we're almost there, but not quite. What's important to know is that all of his students, their writings survive. So we don't have John's original writings, but we do have pieces and copies of some of the writings from his students, and their writings match up with what is supposed to be in John. And not only John, but the rest of the New Testament. So they didn't rewrite anything, but they, just like as Paul is inspiredly writing to different churches, you have the students of these disciples that are also writing to different church leaders too. Now, they're not inspired writings, but they are writing on church and faith-based issues. So then we look at Paul's students. He's got a list here, and history can track that down to Tatian, who died in 180 AD. But once again, all of his students, we can see their writings and see how their writings discuss Jesus and the Gospels in the exact same way as the original Gospel accounts. So none of the evidence was tainted through Paul. So then if we look at Peter, we can look at all the students that were under him, down to Eusebius, who died in 339 AD. And once again, all the disciples that follow under him, their writings, we can see that they describe the New Testament, they describe Jesus in the same way that the original New Testament writings did. And with Eusebius dying in 339, that is within a generation of 350 AD when that oldest complete manuscript was written. So being within a generation, it's pretty safe to say that the chain of evidence there was kept intact. So it wasn't tainted or distorted throughout time. We can see how from the first disciples down to the time period of the Council of Laodicea here, that the New Testament writings were preserved, that they were accurate, they weren't tainted or corrupted in any way. There might have been some specific individual cases where, say, there's a verse missing, or there's an extra verse there that shouldn't be there. But as we've already discussed, between artifacts and evidence and disagreements are not disqualifiers, there's enough evidence there that allows us to realize what shouldn't be there. So we can safely and logically come to the conclusion that the evidence, if you will, for Christ has not been tainted over time. It has been accurately kept as the original writers intended it. So, to recap the entire lesson here, the disciples, based on both internal observations and external historical records, were present during the first century. Similarly, based on looking at the Bible and also looking at external evidences and history, it's reasonable to believe that the information in the Bible is both truthful and accurate. Again, if you look internally and externally, it's reasonable to believe that the disciples had no ulterior motives. They had no reason to lie about it. Lastly, Based on internal observations and external evidences, it's reasonable to believe that the disciples' writings were accurately preserved through time. So they passed all the tests. The Bible passes all of the strictest and most rigorous tests for truthfulness and accuracy. So to conclude the lesson, many still choose not to believe it. They treat the Bible with a guilty until proven innocent mindset. They're approaching it with, well, until I see actual proof that it's true, until God speaks in a booming, thunderous voice to everyone on earth, I'm not going to believe it. But the question isn't whether others are satisfied with all of this evidence. And again, as I mentioned in part 1, barely even scratched the surface. This was just a brief summary. So the question is there enough evidence for you to believe? For you to be convicted that it's true? As once again, Philippians chapter 2 verse 12 says, you have to work out your own salvation. It doesn't matter what your friends believe. It doesn't even matter what your family believes. What matters is your own salvation. And is there enough evidence to convince you? Because if it's true, then you have to obey it. Or suffer the consequences as it describes. So if there's anybody here this morning who maybe you're struggling with your faith, because there are a lot of temptations, there are a lot of reasons for struggles with your faith in this world. And maybe you need to make your life right. Maybe you need to turn the ship around, but you need the support of the church because it's hard to do it alone. It's very hard to have a change of life completely on your own. You got to have a support system, and there's no better support system than the church. Or maybe you haven't truly obeyed the gospel yet. Maybe you haven't put on Christ in baptism, have your sins washed away. Well, whatever your needs may be, if you have any that you'd like the support of the church with, we ask that you would come forward as together we stand and sing.